Hello everyone, I'm Connie Jones. I'm the hospice volunteer and bereavement coordinator for Miles and St. Andrew's Home Health and Hospice. Each year our hospice program provides hospice services to 200 local families and patients. This afternoon we have a very special program planned. Annabelle Baldwin, a hospice volunteer, is going to share stories from a book that she wrote about her own husband's end-of-life journey. Bob was diagnosed in 2007 with a life-threatening illness, and Annabelle's unique perspective as a hospice volunteer and as a caregiver makes for a very inspiring and informative story, and we're excited to share that with you.
Or at least our awareness of it, began dramatically on Father's Day 2007. He was climbing up a steep hill, and suddenly, without warning, he fell over backwards. It was hard for me to understand how this could have happened unless somebody pushed him, but nobody pushed him. He was pushed by something in his brain, some errant neural messenger firing wrong. We had known for 10 years that Bob had a brain tumor, but it had always been well behaved. That meant it was growing very slowly. It did cause seizures. 2 or 3 a year at first, and then increasing till finally it was 2 or 3 a week. The seizures lasted 1 minute, and during that 1 minute he couldn't talk. It was a moment of silence, sometimes poorly timed, but seizures have 2 nasty side effects. First, if you have seizures, you may not drive. That's a flat-out law and no exceptions. And Bob, like most American men, hated not being able to drive. That was really difficult for him. The other thing about seizures is they kill brain cells. And so, neurologists insist that you take anti-seizure medication, which Bob also hated because it dumbed him down. Personally, I thought he was already way too high and could stand a little dumbing down. That was just my opinion. But that's how things were, and not how things became after that Father's Day fall. The summer that followed was a blur of medical appointments and physical therapy and MRIs and a lot more falls. I happened to see 2 of them, and in both of them, Bob fell straight down from his ankles. Never put out a hand to soften the blow, never bent his knees, just straight down, like Marcel Marceau. And his face took a beating. Eventually, late August, we got the diagnosis. His tumor was undergoing a growth spurt. So Bob asked his neuro-oncologist if there would be treatment for it. And the doctor said yes, he had 2 choices. One was a new experimental chemo, which was given by injection once a day for 5 days, and then the patient would have 2 or 3 days off, and then another 5 days of injections. And these injections had to be given at a hospital that was within a half-mile drive of home. And Bob said, "Why so close?" And the doctor said, "Because this drug has a side effect of diarrhea."
Oh, no.
Bob said, "What's the other choice?" And the doctor said, "Do nothing." And Bob said, "That's my choice." So he thought about that doctor visit for about a week. And then he said, "It's time for you to call the women you know." Now, you've got to understand that the tumor was in his left temporal lobe, in his speech center. So he had difficulty finding the right word often, and often I had to guess. And that day, my second guess was, "Hospice?" And he said, "Yes, it's time for you to call hospice." So I did, and they were wonderful, competent, cheerful, always trying to make good things happen. They said to me, "Mrs. Baldwin, you have a good and loving family, and you're making good and loving decisions." Isn't that beautiful? Beautiful thing for them to say. It meant a lot to me. Meantime, a nephew of ours set up a family group on Yahoo so we could give medical bulletins once, and everybody would get them. And Bob's family, using that family group, decided that they would come to Maine for Thanksgiving and to say goodbye to Bob. And our daughter Sari, who lived in South Thomaston, said that she'd host the group. And then Bob's brother Laird called, and he said he didn't think there'd be too much left of Bob by Thanksgiving. So he wanted to come right away, which was fine. So he came from Virginia, stayed a week, brought his banjo with him, and of course Bob had his banjos. And, you know, September in Maine is beautiful. Sunny and dry and no bugs. So they sat outside and they played dueling banjos and sang harmonies day after day for the week. It was such a beautiful time for us. And then on Laird's last day, they went to Moody's Diner for breakfast without any wives to say, "Don't eat that, that's not good for you." And I'm sure they had apple pie for dessert. But when they were leaving Moody's, somehow or other, the car door slammed on Bob's ankle. And nobody told me about it. But that night when we were going to bed, I saw his leg was bruised, vivid blue, from his toes to his knees. And I said, "What is this? What happened?" And he said, "Oh, that's nothing. It's not serious. It doesn't even hurt." And I thought, this is serious. Why doesn't it hurt? Within a few days, he was bedridden. Couldn't move either leg. Meantime, something strange was happening in the rest of the house. The air seemed thick, almost as if you had to wade through it. All of us, all my daughters and my friend Sandy, who stayed with us for a while, we all noticed it. And most of us welcomed it. My daughter Elizabeth, on the other hand, said, "Mom, staying in your house is exhausting. The air is so heavy I can hardly breathe." And she grabbed her computer and headed to town to the coffee shop. This book, Final Gifts, is written by 2 hospice nurses, and I hope everyone has a copy of it. So good. They made notes of what their patients were saying at the end of life, and they found that they fit into about 5 categories that were often concerns of people who were close to the end of their lives. All of us in the family had read the book, and I think Bob wanted to experience all 5 of those. He got to experience 3 of them. first came what the authors of the book call symbolic language. Like the language of dreams, they say. And it was always entertaining. One day Bob said, "My belly's closed now. All the inside buttons are gone." Well, maybe so, but he still had a good appetite. Another day he said, "I'm going to sleep now. When I wake up, I may be gone." We were all fascinated by this kind of talk. Frankly, it didn't occur to any of us that Bob was seriously trying to tell us something. Later on, like many patients who were quoted in Final Gifts, he began to talk about going on a journey. He must have liked that because he loved road trips. He even hopped freights. One day he said to me, "I hope I can fit you in my suitcase." Then one morning, I woke up, he was thrashing around in bed. I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "I need to know what's on the other side of that window." And I said, "Well, the front yard." Well, that wasn't the answer he was looking for. And I said, "Well, that's west. There's the front yard, and then the swampy area, and then the road." He was getting really frustrated, so he tried another window at another wall, and he said, "Okay, what's outside that window?" I said, "Well, more yard, and then the driveway." And he just couldn't take it anymore. And he said, "You'll just have to knock the wall down." And I said, "Well, why would I do that?" And he said, "So I can see where I'm going." Then a third behavior that the nurses describe is that many patients see people the rest of us can't see. And they say, "The fact that you can't see them doesn't mean they're not there." Well, Bob saw a lot of patients. The first one he saw was his brother Stuart. I was just entering the room, and he saw Stuart. Stuart had died 10 years earlier. And he looked and he said, "Stu!" He was so happy. And after Stuart, there were a lot of these invisible people. And Bob talked to them in a language we didn't recognize. It wasn't gobbledygook. It was a language. And I thought it was remarkable that as he was losing his ability in English, suddenly he was given this other language. No lessons required. One day, Liz asked him who he was talking to. And he said, "Them, those people." And she said, "Are there a lot of them?" And he said, "Yeah, a lot of them." And she said, "How many?" He never was good at math. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, no, that's you, isn't it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Made the same mistake 3 times. Evidently, in his perception, Liz and the Invisibles looked the same. Well, time passed, Thanksgiving came, and the Ryder family, everyone stopped to see Bob, and nobody stayed for very long. There wasn't much Bob left. Holly went up to Ceres to help her get her house ready for all the guests. Liz and I stayed with Bob. The plan was I was going to go up to Ceres first, spend a little time with the family, get some Thanksgiving takeout to bring back and eat with Bob, and then when I got back, Liz would go for the rest of the day and the night. That was the plan. It's not what happened. Thanksgiving morning, Bob was desperate to get on with his journey. He had a wild look in his eyes, no words. He was trying to climb out of the hospital bed right over the rail. Him with no control over his legs at all. So I called the hospice nurse. She said to give him Ativan, which I did. And eventually I was able to calm him down. By noon, he was asleep. So I went to Sary's. I'd been there about 5 minutes when the phone rang, and it was Liz. He was awake again and desperately trying to climb out of the bed. I told her where the Ativan was, and she called back within a few minutes and said, he won't take it. She was in tears. She was sobbing. So I said, I'll get there as soon as I can, and I got into the car. Liz left for Sary's immediately. I hid some Ativan in an ice cream sandwich. And within an hour I had him calmed down and asleep. But that pattern continued for all of Thanksgiving Day and all of the next day. Whenever he was awake, he was trying to climb out of the bed. And he wouldn't take the Ativan unless I disguised it. On Saturday, there was no need for the Ativan. He was calm, quiet, didn't want to eat. I knew what that meant. Maybe he had a few sips of water, that would be all. Saturday afternoon, I was coming into his room, and he sat bolt upright, and he thrust out his arm like this, and he said, "No, no!" And then he turned and said, "I'm coming home! I'm coming home!" Those were his last words in English. By evening, I think he was in a coma. Early Sunday morning, his breathing had become the death rattle. I called the hospice nurse, and she came with morphine and something to dry out his lungs a little. Holly and Sari and I were all there. We made a chart with what med to give at what hour, and spent the day drinking coffee and giving meds. When it was time for the 6 o'clock doses, we walked into his room, and Sari said, "He's not breathing." We felt for a pulse. There was no pulse. I put my hand on his chest, and it was hot. He had just left. So, that's our story as I wrote it a few weeks after he died, and as I understood it at the time. Then this past winter, some 8 years after Bob died, Connie asked me to talk to a hospice group about the book and the experience, and I was happy to do that. But as I went over the material, I was stunned at what I had missed the first time through, things I had never noticed, especially connections. I think when you live through something as intense as caring for your husband through his last weeks, you live one day at a time, one task at a time. You focus closely, and as soon as that task is done, there are 3 more over your shoulder waiting for your attention. So there's no time or energy for perspective or making connections. So I missed things like the doctor did tell us the tumor was growing. I might have wondered what part of Bob's brain might be attacked next. but I don't think I ever thought that question. I might have associated the growing tumor with that strange Father's Day fall, or any of the falls that followed, or the bruise that didn't hurt, but I never made that association. I never connected those dots. And there were other dots that I also didn't connect, perhaps more important dots. It's possible that the nurses who wrote Final Gifts also didn't connect the dots. The 5 areas that they say people talk about each got a separate chapter in their book. Now that does make for clearer reading, but it also tends to encourage the likes of me to think of those incidents all as separate. And I now believe that it was all one package. And the behaviors that Final Gifts tells us about were very much associated with everything else that was going on in our house, including that thick atmosphere that some of us thought might have something to do with spirits, possibly the Holy Spirit. We didn't understand it. But we did notice that life was smooth in our house. The phone never rang at noontime, at mealtime. We never ran out of milk or wine. I'm not sure that was associated with the thick atmosphere, but maybe it was. And then there was the strange matter of Bob, the extrovert, turning into someone who craved silence and solitude. It seems strange. Hospice says that people facing death have important work to do. I always assumed that that had to do with broken relationships and money. Well, Bob didn't have any financial work to do because his math skills were very poor. And as for relationships, for years he had been the first person to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that." But there was one little edgy relationship, and that was with his brother Laird. And I think that's why Laird didn't want to wait till Thanksgiving. I think the problem between them had to do with birth order. Bob was 13 years older than Laird and was the oldest of 4. And I guess that when Bob was a teenager, he would take siblings to the circus or the science museum, but maybe he would leave baby Laird home. Maybe something like that. When Laird was with us, if there was any apology made or accepted, I never heard it. What I did hear was 2 brothers playing their banjos, making up harmonies, listening to one another's harmonies, and then making up more harmonies. I think that maybe singing harmonies is the highest form of forgiveness. Then, after Laird had left, there was no financial work to do. There were no more relationships that needed repair. Bob became solitary and wanted silence and was very frustrated if anyone interrupted him. He was working hard at something. And I think it was his future, not his past. Just a guess. So, that's how our way of life was. Bob was concentrating on something and wanted no interruptions, and the rest of us were wading through this thick air. Then Bob began using the symbolic language. I believe now that he was trying to tell us something. When he said, "My belly is closed, all the inside buttons are gone," I think he was talking about something inside him that was no longer available or no longer working, and his access to it had gone. When he said, "I'm going to sleep now, when I wake up I may be gone," I think he was talking about two different worlds. That he might wake up in one world, but part of him might still be in another world. And then there was that line I always loved, "I hope I can fit you in my suitcase." Be reasonable. His 150-pound wife in his luggage? I think that meant that he was preparing for a journey and he really wished I could go with him. And I wished it too. But he did have a foot in two different worlds, it seems to me. And then there was the day he wanted me to knock down the wall so he could see where he was going. He wasn't looking for information about Newcastle, Maine. That was not his destination. One day he asked me if I knew where he was going. That was the big question. I said I thought I knew, and I thought it was going to be wonderful. And that's why I wanted to help him get there. And he just sat back and relaxed, smiled. He was so happy. I don't think he was looking for information about another world. I think he wanted to know if I knew he was dying. And once he knew that I knew, he didn't have to worry about me. So the last end of life kind of behavior that filled his days with those invisible people, I think, he had become an introvert. I think he was done with silence. And I think when the invisible people began arriving, the extrovert in him woke up and had a good time with them. Typically, according to Final Gifts, the patients know the visitors who come, the invisible ones, and know that they are all dead, and they are all welcome. It seemed to them, and it seemed to Bob, that this was a normal part of life, just one we hadn't been looking at up till then. And I guess I should speak a little bit about the language that Bob used. Because by this time, there was no speech center left. There was no way his brain could learn a new language or even speak one, I think. So that language must have come from some other part of him. And that other part of him, I think, was his spirit. Bob had long prayed in tongues. St. Paul tells us that when you pray in tongues, it's the spirit within you praying in words that your voice cannot utter. I think what was happening with Bob was something like that. Not exactly like, but something like. When Bob prayed in tongues, he was praising God. Phrases were repeated over and over again with greater and greater enthusiasm. When he talked to the invisible ones, it didn't sound like that. It sounded more like conversation. He would talk, and then he'd be silent, and then he'd talk. I think he was listening. When I put all of this together, what I see is that as Bob's body approached the end of its life, his spirit took center stage. Last week I remembered a bit of poetry my mother used to recite to me. Who has seen the wind? Neither you nor I. But when the trees bow down their heads, the wind is passing by. Of course, I never saw Bob's spirit, but I did see the effect it had on his body at the end of life. And I did hear the last words he ever spoke in English. I'm coming home, I'm coming home. That's my story.
I danced on a Friday and the sky turned black. It's hard to dance with the devil on your back. They buried my body and they thought I had gone, but I am the dance and I still go on. Dance,